Something is happening right now in the waters between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman that every serious thinker in America needs to stop and examine. Not at the surface level, not the way the headlines are framing it, but at the layer where actual history is being written. Because when you watch US Navy FA-18 Super Hornets firing precision munitions into the smokestacks of Iranian oil tankers, not sinking them, mind you, disabling them with surgical precision, and when you understand what that particular image is designed to communicate not just to Tehran, but to Beijing, to Riyadh, to Moscow, to every single energy importing nation on earth that has been quietly watching this standoff, you begin to realize that what is being called a blockade enforcement operation is in fact something far more layered, far more consequential, and far more strategically constructed than the 30-second clips you are being shown on cable news. The critical realization I want to plant in your mind right now, and we will unpack it fully before this video ends, is this. The most important thing happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not the military action. It is what the military action is preventing you from asking about. U.S. Central Command confirmed that a U.S. fighter jet disabled 2 Iran-flagged unladen oil tankers by firing precision munitions directly into their smokestacks, and they released unclassified video to make sure the world saw it. Military experts explained to major outlets that the Navy jet likely used 500-pound laser-guided bombs to achieve that level of precision. Now think about that for a moment. You have the most powerful military in the history of civilization, a navy with aircraft carriers the size of small cities, strike groups that can project force anywhere on the planet within hours, and they are shooting 500-pound guided bombs into the smokestacks of empty cargo tankers. Not sinking them, not destroying them, disabling them, sending a message. And the question that nobody in mainstream media is pausing to ask is, who exactly is that message for? To understand why this matters at the deepest level, we have to look at the architecture of what has been constructed in the waters around Iran over the past several months. Because this is not a spontaneous military confrontation. This is a carefully choreographed geopolitical performance, and like all great performances, it has multiple audiences watching from multiple angles simultaneously. What we know is that after ceasefire talks collapsed in mid-April, President Trump declared a full naval blockade, announcing that the U.S. Navy would prevent ships from entering or exiting the Strait of Hormuz and intercept any vessel that had paid tolls to Iran. Right now there is an armada of Navy warships, Army attack helicopters, Air Force fighter jets, and 15,000 American service members stationed around the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a small skirmish. This is an unprecedented projection of hard power into one of the most economically sensitive choke points on the face of the earth. The Strait of Hormuz is the passage through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil flows. 20%. And Washington has essentially placed a military padlock on that passage and told the world nothing moves unless we say so. Now, the mainstream narrative wants you to interpret this through a very simple moral lens. Iran is the bad actor. The blockade is the justified response. The tanker strikes are law enforcement. Move along. Nothing to see here. But if you have been paying attention, and the fact that you are watching this video suggests that you have, you already know that geopolitics does not operate in the language of simple moral lenses. It operates in the language of leverage, interest, and positioning. And when you translate this crisis into that language, a very different picture begins to emerge. Let me ask you this, and I genuinely want your thoughts in the comments below. At what point does a defensive blockade become an act of economic warfare? Because what Washington has constructed in the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a military operation. Since the blockade began, the U.S. military has directed over 52 commercial vessels to turn around or return to port. These are not Iranian ships, these are international commercial vessels carrying cargo belonging to buyers and sellers in Asia, in Europe, in the developing world. Every single one of those redirected ships represents an economic disruption that ripples outward. Higher shipping costs, delayed deliveries, broken supply chains, energy price volatility in countries that are already under enormous economic stress. The blockade is not just squeezing Iran, it is sending a very loud and very deliberate message to every nation on earth that dares to trade outside of American sanction frameworks, and that message is, we control the arteries, never forget it. But to understand why this moment is so historically significant, we have to go back further and look at what actually brought us to this point, because the conventional story, the one where this is simply about Iran's nuclear ambitions or its support for regional militias, is radically incomplete. The issues under discussion in ongoing negotiations include not just freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, but Iran's nuclear and ballistic program, reconstruction, sanctions relief, and a long-term peace agreement. When you lay those issues side by side, you are not looking at a dispute about a weapons program. You are looking at a comprehensive renegotiation of the entire regional order: who controls energy, who gets to trade, who gets to develop economically, and who has to remain under the financial thumb of the Western-dominated global system. Iran's frozen assets, its inability to sell oil freely, the sanctions architecture that has strangled its economy for decades, these are not consequences of Iran's behavior. They are tools of structural control, and what you are watching unfold in the Strait of Hormuz right now is the most dramatic and dangerous moment yet in Iran's attempt to break free from that control and Washington's determination to prevent it. Now, here is where it gets genuinely interesting and where I think most of the commentary you are reading completely misses the point. Behind the scenes, a one-page 14-point memorandum of understanding is being negotiated between Trump's envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and several Iranian officials, both directly and through mediators. In its current form, the MOU would declare an end to the war and begin a 30-day period of negotiations on a detailed agreement to open the Strait, limit Iran's nuclear program, and lift U.S. sanctions, and Iran's restrictions on shipping and the U.S. naval blockade would be gradually lifted during that period. So let me make sure you are following this carefully. On Friday, American fighter jets are firing laser-guided bombs into Iranian tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, and simultaneously, in quiet rooms in Islamabad and Geneva, American and Iranian diplomats are hammering out a peace memorandum. These two realities are not contradictory. They are the two hands of the same strategy. The military pressure is the negotiating leverage. The tanker strikes are not a breakdown of diplomacy. They are diplomacy conducted by other means. This is the chessboard, and you need to see it as a chessboard, not as a news cycle, not as a series of isolated events, but as a strategic game in which every move is calculated several steps ahead. The player who strikes an empty tanker with a precision bomb and releases the video to global media is not simply enforcing a blockade. He is communicating his willingness to escalate, his precision, his restraint, all at once. He is telling Tehran, we can do far worse, and we haven't. He is telling Beijing, the oil you count on flows because we allow it. He is telling European capitals, your energy security exists at our discretion. And he is telling domestic audiences, we are strong, we are decisive, we are in control. In one strike, 4 audiences, 4 different messages. This is the sophistication of modern power projection, and almost none of the coverage you are consuming is capturing it. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi posted publicly that every time a diplomatic solution is on the table, the US opts for a reckless military adventure. And I want to sit with that statement for a moment because it is genuinely revealing, not because it is accurate or inaccurate in its framing, but because it tells you what Iran's strategic communication objective is. Iran needs to position itself both domestically and internationally as the party that is seeking peace while being subjected to aggression, because that is the narrative that keeps its remaining allies sympathetic, that keeps China and Russia from fully abandoning it to its fate, and that gives its negotiators the domestic political cover they need to make concessions. When Araghchi says the US is choosing military adventure over diplomacy, he is not describing reality as it is. He is constructing a narrative reality that serves Iran's strategic position. And Washington knows this, and Washington is doing exactly the same thing on its side of the board. This is not a conflict between good and evil. This is a conflict between 2 sets of interests, 2 sets of narratives, and 2 sets of audiences. And the people who pay the highest price are always the ones caught in the middle who believed one narrative entirely. Which brings me to a question that I think deserves serious reflection, and I want you to weigh in below. What does it tell us about the current global order that the United States can impose a blockade on an entire nation's ports, redirecting over 50 international commercial vessels, without a UN Security Council resolution, without a formal declaration of war, without the legal architecture that international law ostensibly requires? The extent of damage to both Iran and the region is extensive, with one Iranian official suggesting there has been $270 billion in direct and indirect damages within Iran alone, $270 billion, and yet the mechanism that was supposed to exist to adjudicate exactly this kind of situation, the international rules-based order, the United Nations framework, the international courts, is effectively silent, or rather, it is not silent. It is selectively vocal. It speaks loudly when the interests of the dominant powers align with its speaking. It falls quiet when they do not. And this is the deep structural reality that this crisis is illuminating for anyone willing to look at it honestly. The Global South is watching this very carefully, because what they are witnessing is a demonstration of something they have long suspected but have rarely seen stated so plainly, that the rules of the international order apply to the powerful only insofar as the powerful choose to apply them to themselves. Saudi Arabia has called for talks to address all issues that have contributed to regional instability over the past decades, while the UAE has called for the unconditional reopening of the Strait and for Iran to be held liable for reparations. Notice the difference in those two positions. Saudi Arabia is speaking the language of a country that wants a comprehensive settlement. The UAE is speaking the language of a country that wants a punitive outcome. And those two positions reflect a genuine fracture within the Gulf Arab world about what the post-war regional order should look like, a fracture that Washington will need to manage very carefully if it wants to construct a durable peace rather than a temporary pause between rounds of conflict. Now let me bring you to that critical realization I promised you at the beginning, because I think this is where this entire situation crystallizes into something that genuinely matters for the American public, not just as observers of foreign policy, but as citizens of a country that is making enormous commitments of treasure and military power in a region where the strategic calculus is shifting beneath everyone's feet. Here is the thing that is not being said loudly enough in any of the coverage you are consuming. The United States is simultaneously blockading Iran and negotiating with Iran. It is simultaneously striking Iranian vessels and pursuing a memorandum of understanding with Iranian officials. It is simultaneously applying maximum military pressure and signaling maximum diplomatic flexibility. And the reason this dual-track strategy is being employed is not because Washington is confused or contradictory. It is because the administration understands something very fundamental. Iran cannot be crushed into unconditional surrender without consequences that would be catastrophic for the region, for global energy markets, and ultimately for the United States itself. Iranian President Pezeshkian has described the payment of reparations as the only way to end the conflict, while Vice President Vance has said Iran must act like a normal country before the US treats it economically like a normal country. These are not the positions of two parties on the verge of a clean settlement. These are the positions of two parties engaged in a long, grinding negotiation in which neither side can afford to fully capitulate and neither side can afford to walk away. And here is where I want you to think about what comes after, because that is the question that matters most. Suppose a deal is reached, suppose the memorandum is signed, the blockade is gradually lifted, the Strait reopens and the region exhales. What will the post-war order look like? Who will have gained? Who will have lost? And critically, what structural changes will have been locked in that will shape energy flows, regional alliances, and great power competition for the next several decades? Because I can tell you this, no matter how this immediate crisis resolves, the fundamental tension that produced it, between an American-led global order built around dollar dominance and energy control on one side, and a multipolar world in which nations are increasingly seeking economic and political sovereignty on the other, that tension does not resolve with a 14-point memorandum. It deepens, it shifts terrain, it finds new flashpoints. The Strait of Hormuz is not the end of something, it is the opening act of a much longer drama about who gets to write the rules of the 21st century global order. What you are watching in the waters off Iran's coast right now is not fundamentally about Iran. It is about the system. It is about whether the architecture of global power that was constructed after 1945 and reinforced after 1991 can survive the pressure of a world in which more and more nations are finding the will and the means to challenge it. The tanker strikes, the blockade, the diplomatic back channels, the leaked memorandums, all of it is part of a struggle that is far older and far larger than any single administration, any single nation, or any single crisis. And the Americans who understand this, who refuse to accept the 30-second clip and the cable news frame and demand to understand the deeper structural reality, those are the Americans who will be equipped to think clearly about what their country should actually be doing in the world. Not reacting, not performing, thinking, that is the work that matters. And it starts by asking better questions than the ones you are being handed. So let me ask you one more. Given everything you now understand about the dual-track strategy being employed in the Strait of Hormuz, the simultaneous military pressure and diplomatic outreach, do you believe a genuine, durable peace settlement is achievable? Or are we watching the management of a permanent state of controlled tension that serves powerful interests on both sides? Leave your answer below, because this conversation is too important to have anywhere else.